title: The Resonance. Chapter 1: The Forgotten Melody. Alex wandered through the dim, musty aisles of the second-hand store, his fingers trailing across old records and stacks of vinyls, looking for something unique to use for his upcoming music composition project. The store was cluttered and quiet, the only sounds the low hum of fluorescent lights and the faint shuffling of the elderly store clerk in the back. He was almost ready to leave when something caught his eye. Nestled between dusty jazz records and classical collections was a plain, black vinyl in a faded, cracked sleeve. There was no cover art, no title, just a single word handwritten in red on the sleeve: Resonance. Something about the word pulled at him, an inexplicable curiosity that he couldn't shake. He picked up the record, feeling its weight in his hands. It looked old, worn, as if it had been played countless times. For reasons he couldn't quite explain, he felt a slight shiver crawl up his spine as he turned it over, examining the faint scratches and marks etched into the vinyl. "Find something interesting?" The raspy voice of the clerk startled him. Alex turned, holding up the record. "What's this? Do you know anything about it?" The clerk squinted, his gaze shifting to the record in Alex's hands. His eyes widened slightly, a shadow crossing his expression. "That one's been here for as long as I can remember," he said slowly. "No one's ever asked about it before." "Do you know who brought it in?" The clerk shook his head, an uncomfortable look settling on his face. "No, and honestly, I'd be careful with that one. Strange things tend to follow it." His voice was low, barely above a whisper, as though he were sharing a dark secret. "If you listen to it, don't say I didn't warn you." Alex's curiosity only grew. He had always been drawn to the unknown, to the strange, and this record felt like it held secrets he was eager to uncover. Ignoring the clerk's warning, he paid for it and left, clutching the record tightly in his hands. Later that evening, back in his dorm room, Alex set up his turntable. The room was quiet, his roommate gone for the weekend. The stillness was almost oppressive, as if the air itself was waiting in anticipation. He slid the record from its sleeve, carefully placing it on the turntable and lowering the needle. For a few seconds, there was only silence, a faint crackle and hiss. And then, the music began. At first it was soft, a gentle melody that was almost hypnotic. But as it continued, the notes grew stranger, more dissonant, clashing against each other in a way that felt unsettling. The melody seemed to twist and bend, each note stretching into something that felt unnatural, as though it were trying to reach into his mind. A chill ran down Alex's spine. The music was hauntingly beautiful, yet wrong, as though it were speaking a language he couldn't understand. He couldn't help but feel as if the notes were crawling into his ears, wrapping around his brain, and sinking deep into his thoughts. He closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him, trying to focus on each note. But as he did, a strange sensation crept over him, a heavy, sinking feeling in his chest, and a faint, throbbing headache that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the music. He tried to pull away, to lift the needle and stop the record, but his hands felt heavy, almost as if they were anchored to his sides. The melody seemed to weave itself into his mind, filling every corner, every crevice, until there was nothing left but the haunting, twisting sound. And then, just as abruptly as it had begun, the music stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Alex opened his eyes, blinking in confusion, his hands trembling. The room felt colder, the air thick and oppressive, pressing down on him from every side. He took a deep breath, trying to shake off the lingering unease, but the melody continued to echo in his mind, faint and haunting, as if it had embedded itself into his very thoughts. He reached out to stop the record, his fingers brushing against the edge of the vinyl. For a moment, he thought he felt something warm beneath his fingertips, a faint, pulsing sensation, like a heartbeat. He jerked his hand back, his pulse quickening. "It's just a record," he told himself, trying to calm his racing heart. Just an old, dusty record. But even as he tried to brush off the feeling, a strange thought crept into his mind. A compulsion, a whisper that urged him to listen again, to let the music take him deeper. He pushed the thought away, standing up and turning off the turntable. He needed a break, something to clear his mind. As he moved around his dorm room, the faint melody continued to echo in his mind, refusing to fade. It was like an itch he couldn't scratch, a presence that lingered at the edge of his consciousness, waiting for him to give in. He tried to distract himself, watching videos online, texting friends, even pacing the room. But no matter what he did, the melody remained, a soft, insistent whisper that seemed to grow louder with every passing minute. Finally, he lay down on his bed, staring up at the ceiling, his mind still haunted by the melody. He tried to sleep, but every time he closed his eyes, he could see flashes of strange images, empty hallways, shadowy figures lurking in the darkness, faces twisted in silent screams. The images were brief, like flickers of a nightmare just beyond his reach, yet vivid enough to make his heart race. After what felt like hours of restless tossing and turning, he finally drifted off, his dreams filled with shadows and strange, distorted sounds. He found himself walking down a narrow, dark corridor, the walls lined with mirrors that reflected his own face, twisted and distorted, his eyes empty and hollow. In his dream, the melody played softly, echoing through the corridor, growing louder with each step. He tried to turn back, to escape the sound, but his feet moved on their own, carrying him deeper into the darkness, toward the source of the music. He woke with a start, his heart pounding, his body drenched in sweat. The room was silent, but the melody still lingered in his mind, a faint echo that refused to fade. He sat up, running a hand through his hair, his mind racing with fear and confusion. The record sat on the turntable, silent and still, yet he could feel its presence, a heavy weight that filled the room, pressing down on him. He wanted to get rid of it, to throw it out, to forget it ever existed. But as he looked at it, he felt the same compulsion he'd felt earlier, a strange, insistent pull that urged him to listen again. He shook his head, forcing himself to look away. He needed sleep, needed to clear his mind. Tomorrow, he told himself, he would get rid of the record, return it to the store, and put the whole experience behind him. But as he lay back down, the melody crept back into his thoughts, filling his mind with whispers, echoes of the haunting tune that had woven itself into his very soul. And as he drifted off to sleep once more, he couldn't shake the feeling that the music was waiting for him, lurking in the darkness, ready to pull him deeper into its grasp. Chapter 3: The Echo in the Mind. For the next few days, Alex was haunted by the melody, an unshakable presence that seemed to settle deeper into his mind with each passing hour. The line between waking and dreaming blurred, and he couldn't tell if the song was playing in his mind or somewhere just out of reach. It was as though the music had lodged itself in his brain, filling every empty space, every silent moment with its twisted, haunting tune. He tried to avoid the record, even hiding it in a drawer, but it didn't matter. The melody was already there, a constant undercurrent in his thoughts, echoing through his mind even in moments of silence. He would hear it faintly in the hum of fluorescent lights, in the rustle of leaves, even in the drone of passing cars. Every sound seemed to carry a piece of the melody, as if it had imprinted itself on the world around him. It was inescapable. At night, the melody grew stronger, louder, slipping into his dreams and twisting them into nightmares that left him drenched in sweat and gasping for breath. He dreamed of dark corridors lined with mirrors that reflected versions of himself he didn't recognize, versions with hollow eyes and twisted smiles that stretched too wide. He would find himself lost in endless hallways, each turn leading him back to that same haunting tune, pulling him deeper, closer to something that lurked just beyond his reach. One morning, as he stood in front of the bathroom mirror, he noticed dark circles under his eyes, his face pale and drawn. He barely recognized himself, and a chill ran down his spine as he felt the faint echo of the melody reverberate within him, as if his own heartbeat had taken on its rhythm. He turned away from the mirror, desperate to shake off the lingering sense of dread that clung to him, and decided to visit the library. Perhaps he could find something to distract himself, something to drown out the incessant music that seemed to have invaded every corner of his mind. As he wandered through the dimly lit aisles of the library, his eyes caught on the spine of an old worn book. It was titled Echoes of the Mind: The Power of Sound and Memory. Something about the title called to him, and he pulled the book from the shelf, flipping through its yellowed pages. The book detailed experiments and theories about sound, how certain frequencies could affect the human mind, influence emotions, even unlock hidden memories. One chapter in particular caught his attention: resonant frequencies and altered states of consciousness. It described cases where individuals had experienced hallucinations, memory lapses, and even personality changes after exposure to specific sound patterns. As he read, he felt a strange sense of recognition, as though the book was describing his own experiences. A cold shiver ran down his spine as he realized that the melody could be more than just music. Perhaps it was designed to evoke something dark, something that could take root in his mind and grow like a parasite, feeding on his thoughts, his memories, his very identity. He quickly closed the book, his heart pounding, and shoved it back onto the shelf. The library felt darker, more oppressive, the air thick with a sense of unseen eyes watching him. He left, hurrying back to his dorm, but the unease followed him, a cold weight that settled over him like a shadow. That night, as he lay in bed, the melody grew louder, filling the room with its twisted, haunting tune. He tried to block it out, covering his ears, but it was no use. The sound was inside him, a part of him, resonating through his mind like a dark echo that refused to fade. He could feel it probing, slipping into his memories, twisting them, warping them into something dark and unfamiliar. Moments from his childhood, once bright and warm, became shrouded in shadow, distorted by the haunting melody that pulsed through his mind. Images flickered behind his closed eyes. A playground bathed in unnatural shadows, his sister's face turned away, obscured, her laughter twisted into a mocking echo of the melody. He tried to hold on to the real memories, to keep them pure, but the music was relentless, seeping into every corner of his mind, staining everything it touched. He opened his eyes, staring into the darkness of his room, and felt a sudden, chilling realization settle over him. The melody wasn't just something he had heard, it was becoming a part of him, a dark presence that had embedded itself into his thoughts, his memories, his very soul. "Come closer." The words drifted through his mind, soft and insidious, carried on the melody's haunting tune. He didn't know where the voice was coming from, but it felt familiar, as though it were his own, twisted and distorted by the darkness that had taken hold of him. He sat up, his heart pounding, his hands shaking. He couldn't keep going like this. The melody was consuming him, taking over his mind, his life. He needed to break free, to find a way to rid himself of the music that had invaded his thoughts. The next morning, Alex made his way to a small, forgotten record store on the edge of town, a place he had stumbled upon years ago. He remembered that the owner was known for his strange collection of rare and obscure records, and he hoped that maybe, just maybe, the man would know something about resonance. The shop was dimly lit, the shelves crammed with dusty records and stacks of old vinyl. The faint scent of mildew lingered in the air, and the quiet was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional scratch of the record spinning softly in the background. The owner, an old man with a shock of white hair and piercing eyes, looked up as Alex entered, his gaze sharp and assessing. Alex felt a flicker of unease under the man's gaze, but he pushed it aside, his desperation outweighing his discomfort. I have a record," Alex began, pulling the black vinyl from his bag. "It's called Resonance. I got it from a second-hand store, and I was hoping maybe you could tell me something about it." The man's expression darkened as he looked at the record, his eyes narrowing. He didn't reach out to take it. Instead, he folded his arms across his chest, his gaze never leaving the vinyl. "Resonance," he said slowly, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "I haven't heard that name in a long time." "You know it?" Alex asked, his voice filled with hope and fear. The man nodded, a faint shadow passing over his face. "It's one of the cursed records, said to hold a melody that can change a person, consume them from the inside out. A dangerous piece. Most who hear it never come back the same." Alex's heart raced, a cold chill spreading through him. Is there any way to get rid of it?" To break its hold. The man shook his head. Once the melody takes root, it's almost impossible to remove. The music binds itself to your mind, becomes a part of you. Destroying the record might break its influence, but it's never that simple. He leaned forward, his gaze intense, as though peering into Alex's soul. You may destroy the vinyl, but the melody is already inside you. It's been planted, and from what I see, it's growing. A sense of dread settled over Alex as he listened, the weight of the man's words pressing down on him like a shroud. He had hoped for answers, a way to free himself from the music's grip. But instead, he was faced with a chilling truth, that the melody was no longer just a sound, a piece of music. It was a part of him, a presence that had taken root in his mind, twisting him from within. "Isn't there anything I can do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man's gaze softened, a flicker of pity in his eyes. "There are legends," he said slowly, "of a place where the music was first recorded. A studio, long abandoned, where the composer conducted his experiments. Some say, if you go there, you might find a way to end it, to break free. But I've never known anyone who returned from that place." Alex felt a cold determination settle over him, a resolve born of desperation. He didn't care how dangerous it was, or what he might find. He had to try. The melody was consuming him, and if he didn't stop it, he knew he would lose himself completely. He thanked the man, clutching the record tightly in his hands, and left the store, his mind filled with visions of dark corridors and twisted reflections, of a place where the melody had first been born. As he walked back to his dorm, he felt the music stirring within him, its haunting tune growing louder, filling every corner of his mind. Chapter 4. The Pull of the Forgotten Studio. The melody felt stronger than ever, twisting through Alex's mind like a dark fog. Each step he took toward the old studio filled him with a strange combination of dread and anticipation, as though he were walking towards something both terrible and inevitable. He had spent the night tossing and turning, haunted by echoes of the tune and visions of a place cloaked in darkness, a place where the melody had come to life. By morning, he had made his decision. He would go to the abandoned studio. If there was any chance that he could end the song's grip on him, he had to try. The address the record store owner had given him led to an area he had never ventured into, a forgotten part of town where buildings slumped in decay and broken streetlights flickered in the mist. The air was thick and cold as he reached the street, shrouded in a fog that muffled every sound. The building stood before him, an ominous figure silhouetted against the grey sky. Its windows were cracked, the glass opaque with grime, and the bricks were covered in faded graffiti. Despite the daylight, the structure seemed cloaked in shadows, exuding a feeling of abandonment and isolation. Alex pushed the door, which groaned open with an eerie echo that sent a shiver down his spine. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and decay, a stale scent that made him cough. He could feel the melody stirring within him, as if it recognized the place, as if it were waking up. With each step, his surroundings grew darker. The faint light filtering in from the broken windows barely illuminated the interior, leaving most of the hallway in shadow. His footsteps echoed in the silence, a reminder that he was utterly alone, or perhaps he wasn't. The faint, haunting strains of the melody began to fill his ears. He clutched his head, desperate to shake the sound, but it only grew louder, resonating through his mind. It was as though the music were calling him, guiding him deeper into the building, pulling him towards something hidden within its depths. The hallway stretched on, narrowing as he walked, the walls closing in around him. A strange chill filled the air, sending goosebumps up his arms. Shadows danced at the edges of his vision, shifting and twisting as if alive, and he had the uneasy feeling that something was watching him from the dark. "Come closer," a voice whispered, soft and chilling. It was barely audible, blending with the melody that pulsed in his mind, but he knew it was real. He quickened his pace, his heart pounding. The hall seemed endless, each step only taking him deeper into the dark, until finally he reached a door at the end. It was old, its wood cracked and splintered, as though it had been left untouched for decades. Painted across it in faded, uneven letters were the words, Studio B. Taking a deep breath, he reached for the doorknob, his hand shaking. As his fingers touched the cold metal, he felt a rush of energy, a sensation that coursed through him like a jolt, filling him with a mix of fear and anticipation. The melody was louder now, more insistent, as if it were urging him to enter. He turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room beyond was dark, with only a single light hanging from the ceiling, flickering and casting shadows across the walls. The room looked like it had once been a recording studio. A control panel sat against one wall, covered in dust and wires. In the center of the room stood a large glass recording booth, the door slightly ajar, its interior swallowed in shadow. As he stepped inside, the door behind him creaked shut, the sound echoing in the silence. He was now sealed in, alone with the melody that pulsed through his mind, filling the room like a presence, almost tangible. He moved toward the control panel, running his fingers over the dusty knobs and switches. The buttons looked worn, as though they had been used countless times. A sense of familiarity washed over him, as though he had been here before, as though he knew this place intimately. The feeling was unsettling, like a memory that wasn't his own. "Sit down," a voice whispered, soft and cold, filling his mind. He obeyed, lowering himself into the chair before the control panel. His hands moved on their own, adjusting knobs, pressing buttons, as if guided by an unseen force. He felt detached, as though watching himself from a distance, a puppet moving to the tune of the melody that filled the air. The light in the room flickered, casting strange shadows across the walls, and the melody grew louder, filling every corner of his mind, drowning out his thoughts. He could feel it seeping into him, merging with him, until he could no longer tell where the music ended, and he began. Suddenly, a loud crackle filled the room, the speakers humming to life. The melody poured out, clear and haunting, filling the air with its twisted, dissonant tune. It was beautiful and terrible, a sound that was both familiar and alien, as though it were a piece of his own soul turned inside out. As he listened, he saw shadows shifting at the edges of the room, dark figures that moved with the rhythm of the melody. Their shapes were indistinct, amorphous, but their presence was undeniable, filling the room with a sense of dread that clawed at his chest. The figures seemed to watch him, their hollow eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. He could feel their gaze penetrating him, slipping into his mind, filling him with a cold, consuming emptiness. He tried to look away, but he couldn't move, his body frozen as the figures drew closer, their dark forms twisting and writhing, merging with the shadows. One figure stood out from the rest, a tall, thin shape with an aura of darkness so thick it seemed to distort the air around it. Its face was shrouded, hidden in shadow, but he could feel its gaze boring into him, cold and calculating. "You brought the melody here," the figure said, its voice a chilling echo that filled his mind. "It has waited for so long." Alex's heart pounded, his breaths shallow. He wanted to respond, to ask what the figure meant, but his voice was trapped, his words choked by the suffocating presence of the melody. The music was louder now, filling his mind, drowning out every thought, every shred of will he had left. The figure extended a hand, its fingers long and thin, and he felt a force pulling him forward, compelling him to stand and move toward the recording booth. The glass door creaked open, and he stepped inside, the air thick and heavy, pressing down on him like a weight. As he entered, the door shut behind him, sealing him inside. The light above flickered, casting the booth in darkness, and he was left alone, surrounded by shadows and the relentless, haunting melody that filled his mind. In the dim light, he saw a microphone hanging from the ceiling, its surface covered in dust and cobwebs. He reached out, his fingers trembling, and touched it. A surge of energy coursed through him, filling him with a sense of dread, as if the microphone itself held a dark, malevolent presence. "Sing," the voice commanded, filling his mind with an undeniable force. He opened his mouth, and to his horror, the melody began to spill out, his voice blending with the music, weaving into the very fabric of the tune. The sound was beautiful and terrible, a haunting, twisted echo that filled the room, resonating through his soul. As he sang, he felt something shifting within him, a dark presence rising from the depths of his mind, merging with the melody, becoming one with the music. He was losing himself, his thoughts, his memories dissolving into the darkness, until there was nothing left but the sound, the haunting, relentless tune that had taken hold of his soul. He tried to stop, to pull away, but he couldn't. The music had him now, a dark force that held him captive, compelling him to continue, to sing the melody that had become a part of him. The shadows drew closer, their hollow eyes fixed on him, their forms twisting and writhing in time with the music. He could feel them slipping into his mind, filling the empty spaces left by the melody, merging with him, until he was no longer himself, but something else, something dark and hollow, a vessel for the melody that had consumed him. And in that final moment, as the last note faded, he realized that he had become part of the song, a voice woven into the melody, an echo trapped in the darkness. The light above flickered one last time, casting the room in shadow, and then silence. The studio was empty, the room still and quiet, as though no one had ever been there, but the melody lingered, a faint, haunting echo that filled the air, waiting for the next soul to stumble upon it, to listen, to let it in. And somewhere in the darkness, a new voice joined the song, a whisper in the shadows, forever bound to the melody. Chapter 5. Whispers in the silence days passed in a blur of darkness and silence. Alex returned to his dorm, yet he felt as if a part of him had never left the studio. The melody lingered, faint yet persistent, echoing through his mind like a haunting whisper that refused to fade. His thoughts felt murky, his memories fragmented, as though pieces of himself had been left behind in the shadows of the recording booth. He tried to go about his usual routine, attending classes, talking to friends, but nothing felt real. Conversations drifted by like fog, his friends' faces blurring, their voices blending into a low hum that barely registered in his mind. All he could hear was the melody, a soft, insidious presence that filled every corner of his consciousness. One evening, as he sat alone in his room, the familiar pull of the record grew stronger, a dark compulsion that he could no longer resist. The vinyl sat on his desk, silent and still, yet he felt its presence pressing down on him, filling the air with a heavy, suffocating weight. He reached out, his hand trembling as he brushed his fingers against the surface. The moment he touched it, a surge of energy shot through him, filling him with a dark, consuming thrill. He felt the melody stir within him, its haunting notes slipping into his mind, wrapping around his thoughts, pulling him deeper into its grasp. He closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him, filling him with a strange, hollow peace. And then he heard a whisper. It was soft, barely more than a breath, but unmistakable. The voice was familiar, yet distorted, its tone twisted by the dark resonance of the melody. It echoed through his mind, slipping into his thoughts like a shadow. "Come closer, Alex." He opened his eyes, his heart pounding as he looked around the room. He was alone, yet the whisper continued, filling the silence, a dark, insistent call that tugged at him, urging him to follow. The compulsion was overwhelming, a force that seemed to grip him from within, pulling him toward the door. He moved as if in a trance, his footsteps slow and unsteady, his mind foggy, his thoughts clouded by the faint echo of the melody that pulsed through his veins. He left his dorm and walked through the empty halls, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The whisper guided him, a soft, insidious voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, slipping into his mind, filling him with a dark, growing dread. The campus was deserted, the buildings shrouded in shadow, the air thick and oppressive. He felt a chill settle over him, a cold that seeped into his bones, yet he couldn't stop, couldn't resist the pull of the whisper that guided him. The whisper led him back to the edge of town, to the abandoned building that housed the forgotten studio. The sight of it filled him with a mixture of fear and anticipation, a dark thrill that quickened his pulse. The building loomed before him, its windows dark and empty, like hollow eyes watching him, waiting for him to enter. The door was slightly ajar, as if inviting him in. He stepped inside, the darkness swallowing him, filling the air with a suffocating weight. The melody was stronger here, a faint hum that pulsed through the walls, resonating through the floor, vibrating through his body. The studio had changed since his last visit. The once familiar hallways seemed twisted, warped, as though the shadows had shifted, closing in around him. The walls felt closer, the darkness thicker, as though it were alive, pressing down on him, filling his mind with whispers that merged with the melody, a cacophony of voices that echoed through his thoughts. He reached Studio B, the door creaking open as he approached. The control room was empty, silent, yet he felt a presence lurking in the shadows, a dark, malevolent force that watched him, waiting. The glass booth stood at the center of the room, its door slightly ajar, a shadowy void that seemed to pulse with the same dark resonance as the melody in his mind. He knew he shouldn't enter, knew that stepping inside would only take him deeper into the darkness, but the pull was irresistible. He stepped into the booth, the door closing behind him with a soft click. The air was cold, thick with the scent of dust and decay, and he could feel the walls closing in around him, pressing down on him with a suffocating weight. As he stood there, the whispers grew louder, merging into a single voice that filled his mind, a dark, insidious tone that echoed through his thoughts. "You belong to me now, Alex." The voice was familiar, yet twisted, a distorted echo of his own voice, filled with a malice that sent a shiver down his spine. He felt a cold hand settle on his shoulder, a weight that chilled him to the core. Yet when he turned, there was nothing there, only shadows that seemed to shift and writhe, taking on dark, twisted shapes. The melody filled the booth, a haunting tune that pulsed through his veins, slipping into his mind, filling every corner of his consciousness with its dark resonance. He could feel it probing, slipping into his memories, twisting them, warping them into something dark and unfamiliar. Visions flashed before his eyes, twisted reflections of himself, faces he didn't recognize, eyes hollow and empty, mouths stretched into twisted smiles. The images shifted, blending into one another, merging with the melody, until he could no longer tell where the visions ended and reality began. He felt his sense of self slipping, his thoughts dissolving into the music, until he was nothing more than an echo, a hollow shell filled with the dark resonance of the melody. And then, just as he felt himself fading, he heard a faint voice, a whisper, soft and familiar, that cut through the darkness. "Alex, don't give in." The voice was faint, barely more than a breath, but it filled him with a warmth, a light that cut through the dark resonance that filled his mind. He clung to it, letting it ground him, pulling him back from the brink. The melody faltered, its grip on his mind loosening as he focused on the voice, the faint echo of something real, something that hadn't yet been consumed by the darkness. He closed his eyes, focusing on the warmth of the voice, letting it fill his mind, his heart, drowning out the haunting tune that had taken hold of his soul. The booth grew silent, the darkness lifting, leaving him alone in the stillness, his mind clear for the first time in days. He opened his eyes, the familiar surroundings of his dorm room coming into focus. The record sat on his desk, silent and still, yet he could feel its presence, a faint, lingering echo of the dark resonance that had filled his mind. He knew he couldn't stay here, that he had to find a way to rid himself of the record, to break free from the melody's grip once and for all. But as he looked at the record, he felt a familiar pull, a dark compulsion that urged him to listen again, to let the music take him deeper into its grasp. He resisted, tearing his gaze away from the record, forcing himself to leave the room, to escape the suffocating presence that filled the air. But even as he walked away, he could hear the faint echo of the melody, a haunting whisper that followed him, filling every corner of his mind with its dark, insidious tune. He knew then that he could never escape, that the melody would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for him to give in. Chapter 6. Echoes in the Dark. Alex hadn't slept in days. The melody had woven itself into the fabric of his mind, an unrelenting presence that filled his thoughts, his dreams, even his silence. The record had become a dark weight, pressing down on him, dragging him into an abyss from which he couldn't escape. Each time he tried to ignore the pull, the compulsion grew stronger, a whisper that called to him, urging him to play the record, to let the melody take him deeper. And no matter how much he fought, the dark resonance continued to grow, spreading like a shadow that consumed every part of him. In a last desperate attempt to escape, he decided to leave his dorm and go to the university library. Perhaps he could distract himself, find something that would anchor him, something that would remind him of reality. The library was dim and silent, the faint hum of the air conditioner the only sound. Rows of towering shelves cast long shadows that stretched across the floor, filling the space with an eerie stillness. He moved through the aisles, his footsteps echoing in the silence, his mind clouded by the melody that pulsed at the edge of his thoughts. He tried to focus on the books around him, to drown out the haunting tune that had taken root in his mind. But the music was relentless, slipping into every corner of his consciousness, twisting his thoughts, filling him with a dark, consuming dread. As he wandered through the aisles, he felt the melody grow stronger, a low hum that resonated through the shelves, vibrating through the walls, filling the air with a strange, oppressive energy. The shadows seemed to shift, closing in around him, the darkness growing thicker, heavier, as though the library itself were alive, watching him, waiting for him to falter. He reached the back of the library, a secluded corner where the older, rarely touched books were kept. The air was cold here, a chill that seeped into his skin, making his hands tremble as he reached for a book at random, hoping to find something that would ground him. The book was old, its cover cracked and faded, the pages yellowed with age. As he flipped through it, he felt a strange sense of familiarity, as though he had seen it before. But as he tried to focus on the words, they blurred, the letters twisting and shifting, until they were nothing but dark, meaningless shapes. The melody grew louder, filling his mind, drowning out every thought, every shred of will he had left. His hands shook, his breath quickened, and he felt a creeping sensation at the back of his neck, as though something were watching him from the shadows. He turned, his heart pounding, and saw a figure standing at the end of the aisle. The figure was shrouded in darkness, its form barely visible, but he could feel its gaze, cold and penetrating, fixed on him with a chilling intensity. His pulse quickened, a sense of dread settling over him as he took a step back, his hands gripping the book as though it were a lifeline. The figure remained still, its face obscured, its eyes hidden in shadow. But he could feel its presence, a dark, malevolent force that filled the air, pressing down on him, slipping into his mind, filling him with a sense of despair that left him feeling hollow. And then, the figure spoke. "Why do you resist, Alex?" The voice was low, distorted, blending with the melody that echoed through his mind. "You cannot escape me. I am in every shadow, every corner of your mind. I am a part of you." Alex took another step back, his heart racing, his breaths coming in shallow gasps. "No, you're nothing but a song. You're not real." The figure let out a soft, mocking laugh, a sound that sent a chill through him, filling him with a sense of dread that rooted him to the spot. "I am more than a song, Alex. I am the darkness you've tried to bury, the fear you've ignored. I am every thought you've tried to escape, and I am stronger than you." The words echoed in his mind, slipping into his thoughts, filling him with a despair that left him feeling empty, hollow. He tried to look away, but he couldn't, his gaze locked on the figure, his body frozen, unable to move. "You can't fight me," the figure continued, its voice a whisper that filled the air, blending with the melody that pulsed through his mind. "You belong to me now, and soon there will be nothing left of you." The shadows around him grew thicker, darker, closing in until he could barely see, barely breathe. The darkness pressed down on him, filling his lungs, his mind, until he was drowning in it, sinking deeper into an abyss from which he couldn't escape. In a final, desperate attempt to break free, he closed his eyes, focusing on a memory, a fragment of light that cut through the darkness, a memory of laughter, of warmth, of a time before the melody had taken hold. He clung to the memory, letting it fill him, pushing back the shadows that threatened to consume him. He could feel the figure's grip loosening, the darkness retreating, if only for a moment. But the melody was relentless, filling every corner of his mind, slipping into his memories, warping them, twisting them into something dark, something that didn't belong to him. He stumbled back, his mind a chaotic swirl of thoughts, of memories, of the haunting tune that had taken over his life. He turned, fleeing the library, his footsteps echoing through the empty aisles, the shadows closing in around him. Patsy stole back in his dorm. He shut the door, his heart pounding, his hands shaking. The room was silent, but he could feel the melody lingering, a dark presence that filled the air, pressing down on him, filling every corner with an oppressive weight. He collapsed onto his bed, his mind racing, his thoughts clouded by the echo of the melody that pulsed through his veins. The record sat on his desk, silent and still, yet he could feel its presence, a dark, insidious pull that called to him, urging him to listen, to let the melody take him deeper. He knew he should destroy it, that he should break it into pieces, anything to rid himself of its influence. But as he reached for it, his hand shook, his fingers hesitating, a part of him unwilling to let it go. The melody whispered to him, a soft, insidious voice that filled his mind, slipping into his thoughts, merging with his own voice until he could no longer tell where he ended and the music began. "You don't want to be free, Alex," the voice whispered, soft and cold. "You want to belong. You want to be a part of something greater, something that will never leave you." He shook his head, his heart pounding, his breaths coming in shallow gasps. "No, I don't want this. I don't want you." The voice laughed, a low, mocking sound that echoed through his mind, filling him with a sense of despair that left him feeling hollow, empty. "You are already mine, Alex. There is no escape. You belong to me, and soon there will be nothing left of you but the melody." He tried to fight it, to push the voice away, but it was too strong, slipping into his thoughts, his memories, twisting them, warping them until he could no longer tell what was real and what was the melody's doing. He felt his mind slipping, his sense of self dissolving, as the melody took hold, filling every corner of his consciousness, drowning out every thought, every memory that had once been his. And in that final moment, as the darkness closed in around him, he heard the voice's final whisper, a soft, chilling echo that filled his mind. "Welcome to the melody, Alex. You are home." And then, there was only silence. Chapter 7. The Boundless Abyss. Alex awoke to darkness, an endless void that stretched in every direction. His surroundings felt unfamiliar and unearthly, as though he had been transported somewhere far from the physical world. He didn't remember falling asleep, didn't remember closing his eyes. It was as though he had been dropped into this abyss without warning, his mind clouded by a lingering fog. He tried to focus, to make sense of where he was, but the melody, the one that had haunted him for days, was everywhere. It filled the air, thick and oppressive, resonating through his mind, his body, his very soul. The sound was no longer a faint whisper, but an overwhelming presence, a living, breathing entity that pulsed with a dark energy he could feel vibrating in his bones. Every attempt to move felt futile, as if he were trapped in some unseen, immovable force. He called out, his voice swallowed by the darkness, lost in the vastness of the void. Panic clawed at him, his heart racing as he realized he might be trapped here forever, bound to the melody's endless pull. Then, the voice came. "Did you think you could escape me, Alex?" The voice was soft, mocking, an insidious whisper that filled the air, as if the melody itself were speaking to him. "You belong here. You've always belonged here." Alex shivered, his skin prickling with a cold dread. He recognized the voice. It was his own, twisted and distorted, filled with malice that felt both foreign and intimately familiar. He tried to push it away, to silence it, but the voice grew louder, merging with the melody that echoed through his mind. "You wanted this, Alex," the voice continued, each word a sinister hiss. "You were drawn to the music, you let it in, and now you are part of it." "No!" Alex cried, his voice raw with desperation. "This isn't what I wanted. I didn't choose this." The voice laughed, a chilling, hollow sound that filled the void, reverberating through him like a shiver. "You may deny it, but deep down, you wanted to be consumed. You were always searching for something beyond yourself, something greater, something eternal, and now you found it." Alex shook his head, his breaths coming in shallow gasps. I just wanted to understand. I didn't know it would—" "Didn't know," the voice interrupted, dripping with contempt. "Or didn't care. You ignored every warning, every sign. You let the melody into your mind, into your soul. And now there's no going back." The words struck him like a blow, filling him with a despair that felt as endless as the darkness around him. He wanted to fight, to push back against the melody's hold, but it had woven itself so deeply into him that he could no longer tell where he ended and the music began. He looked around, desperate for any sign of escape, but the void was empty, stretching endlessly in every direction, a vast expanse of nothingness that seemed to pull him deeper with each passing second. He felt himself sinking, his body heavy, weighed down by the melody that filled the air, as if he were being absorbed into the darkness itself. Then he saw it, a faint, flickering light in the distance. It was barely visible, a tiny point in the vastness of the void, but it drew him, filling him with a flicker of hope. He moved toward it, his steps slow and heavy, each one a struggle against the darkness that clung to him, pulling him back. The light grew brighter as he drew closer, illuminating a narrow pathway that seemed to lead deeper into the void. As he walked, the melody grew softer, fading to a distant hum, and he felt a strange sense of relief, as though he were finally breaking free. But the further he walked, the more he began to realize that the light was not a source of safety, but a trap, an illusion designed to lure him deeper into the darkness. The path twisted and turned, leading him through endless corridors of shadow, the walls shifting and writhing as though alive. He felt as if he were walking through a maze, each turn taking him further from reality, deeper into the melody's grasp. The light flickered, casting eerie shadows that stretched across the walls, twisting into dark, distorted shapes that seemed to watch him, their hollow eyes following his every move. He could feel their gaze, a cold, penetrating stare that filled him with a sense of dread, as though he were being stripped of everything that made him human, leaving only an empty shell. At last, he reached the end of the path, where the light flickered over a door, its surface old and cracked, with strange symbols carved into the wood. The symbols seemed to pulse with a dark energy, resonating with the melody that echoed in his mind, as if they were part of the same dark force that had ensnared him. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob, but the melody urged him forward, a soft, insistent whisper that filled his mind, slipping into his thoughts, filling him with a compulsion he could no longer resist. He opened the door. The room beyond was vast and empty, a dark void stretching out before him, filled with shadows that shifted and writhed, taking on strange, twisted forms. At the center of the room stood a figure shrouded in darkness, its face hidden in shadow. As he stepped closer, the figure turned to face him, and he felt a chill run down his spine. The figure's face was his own, yet twisted and hollow, its eyes dark voids that seemed to pull him in, filling him with a despair that felt endless. "Welcome, Alex," the figure said, its voice soft and mocking. "I've been waiting for you." Alex took a step back, his heart pounding, but the figure moved closer, its gaze fixed on him with a cold, unrelenting intensity. "You tried to resist, but you knew this was inevitable," the figure continued, its voice blending with the melody that filled the air. "You belong to me now. You are part of the song, part of the darkness. There is no escape." Alex shook his head, his hands trembling. "No, I don't belong to you. I am still myself." The figure laughed, a chilling, hollow sound that echoed through the void. "Yourself, your memories, your thoughts, your dreams, they are all mine now. The melody has taken everything. You are nothing but an echo, a hollow shell." He tried to fight back, to push the figure away, but his body felt heavy, weighed down by the darkness that filled the room, slipping into his mind, filling him with a despair that left him feeling hollow. The figure reached out, its hand cold and empty, and touched his shoulder. In that moment, he felt a surge of darkness, a wave of despair that filled him, pulling him deeper into the melody's grasp. "Let go, Alex," the figure whispered, its voice a dark, insidious hiss. "Surrender, become part of the song." He felt his sense of self slipping, his memories fading, until he was nothing more than a fragment, a whisper in the darkness. The figure's face faded, merging with the shadows, and he was left alone, adrift in the void, the melody filling every corner of his mind. And then he was nothing, only the song remained. Chapter 8. The Voice Beyond Silence. The darkness felt endless, thick and consuming, pressing against Alex from every side. He drifted through it like a ghost, weightless, his thoughts fragmented, shattered into pieces. He tried to cling to any remnants of himself, any memory or feeling that might anchor him, but everything was slipping away, dissolving into the void. It was as though he had become part of the melody, a faint, hollow echo caught in a vast symphony of darkness. He could feel the song all around him, weaving through the shadows, filling the silence with its haunting, dissonant tune. Each note felt like a pulse, a heartbeat that resonated through his soul, binding him tighter to the darkness that surrounded him. "You are home now," the melody whispered, its voice soft and insidious, filling every corner of his mind. "You belong to me." The words echoed through him, cold and final, sinking deep into his thoughts. He tried to fight, to push the voice away, but his resistance was weak, fading, like the last flicker of a dying flame. He could feel himself slipping, losing his sense of self, becoming nothing more than a shadow within the melody, an echo that would repeat forever, lost in the darkness. But then, something stirred within him, a faint flickering memory that refused to be extinguished. It was a memory of light, of warmth, a distant echo of laughter that seemed to cut through the darkness, filling him with a strange, unfamiliar sensation. For a moment, the darkness faltered, the melody's grip loosening as he focused on the memory, letting it fill him, anchor him. He could see a face, a familiar face smiling at him, her eyes filled with kindness, warmth. The memory was faint, fragile, like a shadow cast in the dark, but it was enough to give him strength. "Remember," a soft voice whispered, faint and distant, as though coming from beyond the void. "Remember who you are." The voice was familiar, comforting, and he clung to it, letting it pull him back from the brink. He focused on the memory, letting it grow stronger, brighter, until it was no longer just a memory, but a light that cut through the darkness, pushing back the shadows that clung to him. The melody grew angry, its notes sharp and discordant, filling the air with a dark, oppressive energy. "You cannot escape me," it hissed, its voice filled with a cold, consuming malice. "You belong to the song. You are mine." But Alex didn't listen. He held on to the memory, letting it guide him, strengthen him. He could feel the darkness slipping, the melody's hold weakening as he focused on the light, the warmth, the part of himself that the song hadn't been able to consume. The void began to crack, faint lines of light piercing through the darkness, illuminating fragments of memories that had been buried, hidden by the song's influence. He could see flashes of his life, moments of joy, of laughter, of love. Each memory was like a spark, a piece of himself that he had forgotten, lost to the melody's grasp. The darkness fought back, its shadows writhing, twisting, filling the void with a cacophony of angry whispers. But Alex didn't waver. He let the memories fill him, each one a shield against the darkness, a reminder of who he was. He was more than a melody, more than a hollow echo in the dark. He was Alex, a person with a life, with memories, with a soul, and he would not be consumed. With a final surge of strength, he pushed against the darkness, forcing it back, breaking free from the melody's grip. The void shattered around him, the darkness dissolving, replaced by light, warmth, reality. He opened his eyes, his vision blurred, his mind heavy. He was back in his dorm room, lying on his bed, the faint echo of the melody still lingering in his mind. The record lay on his desk, silent and still, its surface reflecting the dim light from the window. He took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs, grounding him, reminding him that he was real, that he was here. The darkness was gone, the melody's grip broken, but he could still feel its presence, a faint, lingering whisper at the edge of his thoughts. He sat up, his hands trembling as he looked around the room, his heart pounding with a mixture of relief and fear. He was free, but he knew the melody wasn't finished with him. It was still there, waiting, lurking in the shadows, a dark presence that he could never truly escape. But he was no longer afraid. He had faced the darkness, fought against it, and emerged whole. The melody had tried to consume him, to take everything he was, but he had resisted, held on to the light, the part of himself that could never be taken. He knew then that the melody would always be with him, a haunting echo in the back of his mind, a reminder of the darkness he had faced. But he would not let it control him, would not let it define him. He was Alex, and he was stronger than the song. Chapter 9. Beneath the Silence. The melody had seeped so deeply into Alex's life that it no longer required sound to haunt him. Even in total silence, the song seemed to hum beneath his thoughts, pulsing like a second heartbeat. It was a constant, dark presence, an itch he could never scratch, a faint, maddening whisper at the edge of his consciousness. Days passed in a blur of muted sounds and shifting shadows. The people around him, classmates, professors, even his closest friends, seemed like distant shapes, their voices muffled as if they were speaking through water. The world had faded, leaving only him and the song, locked in an endless battle of wills. But there was a part of Alex that was too tired to resist. The song had taken so much from him, piece by piece, until he could barely remember who he was. It was as though he was slowly dissolving, fading into the melody itself. He feared the day he would wake up and find there was nothing left of him, only the song. One night, the quiet was so thick, so absolute, that it felt like a suffocating weight pressing down on him. He sat at his desk, staring at the record, which lay untouched, yet emanated a dark allure that drew him like a magnet. The silence wasn't empty. It was alive, vibrating with the faintest hint of the melody, as if the music were embedded in the air itself. He knew he couldn't fight it any longer. The melody wasn't just a song. It was a dark, insidious presence that had invaded every part of him. He had been running from it, resisting, but now he realized there was only one way to end it. He had to face it, to surrender and see where the melody would take him. With shaking hands, he lowered the needle onto the record. The moment the needle touched the vinyl, the room shifted. The air thickened, turning cold, and shadows gathered in the corners, stretching and twisting as if they were alive. The melody began, soft at first, a haunting whisper that filled the air, growing louder, deeper, until it was no longer just a sound, but a force that pulsed through him, filling every corner of his mind. The light in the room flickered, casting long shadows that danced along the walls, moving in time with the melody. Alex felt his surroundings blur, the walls and furniture fading into darkness, until he was alone in a vast, empty space. The music swelled, resonating through him, vibrating in his bones, his mind, as if it were consuming him from the inside out. He took a step forward, unsure of where he was going, but driven by an unseen force, a pull that urged him deeper into the darkness. The air was cold, thick with an oppressive weight that pressed down on him, filling him with a growing sense of dread. As he walked, the shadows around him twisted, forming shapes, figures that moved and shifted, their faces hidden in darkness. He could feel their eyes on him, hollow and empty, watching, waiting. They were neither alive nor dead, but something else, something caught between worlds, bound to the melody just as he was. The figures grew closer, their forms more distinct, and he saw that their faces were reflections of his own. Twisted, distorted versions of himself, each one frozen in a silent scream. They were shadows of his past, fragments of himself that the melody had consumed, leaving only hollow echoes that drifted through the darkness. He reached out, his hand trembling, but the shadows recoiled, slipping back into the dark, their forms dissolving into the melody that filled the air. He could feel their despair, their emptiness, as though they were warning him, urging him to turn back, to escape while he still could. But there was no escape. He had come too far, crossed too many lines, and now he was bound to the song just as they were, caught in its endless pull. "You cannot run from yourself, Alex," a voice whispered, soft and chilling. It was his own voice, yet twisted, filled with a cold, mocking malice that sent a shiver down his spine. You have always belonged to the melody. You let it in, fed it with your fears, your doubts. You are the song now. The words echoed in his mind, slipping into his thoughts, filling him with a despair that left him feeling hollow, empty. He wanted to resist, to push the voice away, but the melody was relentless, filling every corner of his mind, drowning out his thoughts, his memories, his very sense of self. He walked deeper into the darkness, the shadows closing in around him, their forms shifting, writhing, as though they were alive. The music grew louder, a cacophony of voices that echoed through his mind, filling him with a despair that left him feeling hollow, empty. He could feel himself slipping, his sense of self dissolving into the melody, until he was nothing more than a hollow shell, a vessel for the darkness that had claimed him. And in that final moment, as the last note faded, he realized that he was no longer Alex, no longer a person with memories, thoughts, a soul. He was nothing more than a voice in the dark, an echo in the endless void of the song. Chapter 10. Into the Abyss. The silence that followed was suffocating, a void so deep it seemed to pull the very air from his lungs. Alex was submerged in darkness, his own existence slipping away, leaving only a faint echo of the melody that had claimed him. His mind felt like it was splintering, fragments of memories and thoughts dissolving into the void. Every piece of him was unraveling, fading, as though he were being absorbed by the shadows. Yet, just when he thought he would disappear completely, something held him back. A memory, a spark of light in the vast darkness. It was faint and flickering, like a candle in the wind, but it was there. He clung to it, letting it pull him back, grounding him, if only for a moment. The memory grew stronger, filling him with a warmth that cut through the darkness. He could see a face, a girl with kind eyes and a soft smile, someone who had been important to him once. The memory was hazy, distorted by the melody's influence, but it was enough to remind him of who he was, of the life he had once lived. The melody surged, a wave of dark, consuming energy that tried to pull him deeper into the void. But he resisted, holding on to the memory, letting it fill him, anchor him. He could feel the melody's anger, its frustration, as though it were a living entity that wanted to consume him, to erase every part of him that was still human. "You cannot resist me, Alex," the melody whispered, its voice cold and insidious. "You are nothing but an echo, a fragment. You belong to the darkness." The words echoed in his mind, filling him with a despair that left him feeling hollow, empty. He knew the melody was right, that he had let it in, allowed it to consume him. But there was still a part of him that refused to be erased, a part of him that clung to the light, to the life he had once known. "I am more than this," he whispered, his voice trembling but determined. "I am still me." The melody laughed, a chilling, hollow sound that filled the void, reverberating through him like a shiver. "You are nothing, Alex. You are a shadow, a hollow shell. You have no power here." But he did have power. He could feel it, a faint, flickering strength that grew with every second, with every memory he held on to. He remembered his family, his friends, the moments of joy and laughter that had once filled his life. Each memory was like a light in the darkness, pushing back the shadows, filling him with a warmth that the melody couldn't touch. The void began to crack, faint lines of light piercing through the darkness, illuminating fragments of his mind that had been hidden, buried by the melody's influence. He could see flashes of his life, moments of happiness, of love, of connection. Each memory was a piece of himself, a reminder of who he was, of the person he had once been. The darkness fought back, its shadows writhing, twisting, filling the void with a cacophony of angry whispers. But Alex didn't waver. He let the memories fill him, each one a shield against the darkness, a reminder that he was still whole, still human. The void shattered around him, the darkness dissolving, replaced by light, warmth, reality. He opened his eyes, his vision blurred, his mind heavy. He was back in his dorm room, lying on his bed, the faint echo of the melody still lingering in his mind. The record lay on his desk, silent and still, its surface reflecting the dim light from the window. He took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs, grounding him, reminding him that he was real, that he was here. The darkness was gone, the melody's grip broken, but he could still feel its presence, a faint, lingering whisper at the edge of his thoughts. He sat up, his hands trembling as he looked around the room, his heart pounding with a mixture of relief and fear. He was free, but he knew the melody wasn't finished with him. It was still there, waiting, lurking in the shadows, a dark presence that he could never truly escape. But he was no longer afraid. He had faced the darkness, fought against it, and emerged whole. The melody had tried to consume him, to take everything he was, but he had resisted, held onto the light, the part of himself that could never be taken. He knew then that the melody would always be with him, a haunting echo in the back of his mind, a reminder of the darkness he had faced. But he would not let it control him, would not let it define him. He was Alex, and he was stronger than the song.